Dear learners, I'm Christina Georgy and I welcome you to my session. Before we move on to the Metaphysical School of Poetry as such, let me remind you that this particular session is a continuation of what we already discussed in our session on British poetry in the 17th century. Let me also make this clear that this particular session is specially designed for the course code MEG-01 based on its official study material. Okay, so I'll just give you an introduction to metaphysical poets and metaphysical poetry. So this very term metaphysical refers to a loose group of 17th century poets, and these poets were influenced by Donne. The term was considered derogatory in the neoclassical period. Which term? Metaphysical. Okay. So Dryden was the first to use the term metaphysics in the context of Donne's poetry. Who was the first to use the term metaphysics? Dryden. This used to be a question for all these PG entrances, I remember. Yes. Then Donne's poetry affects the metaphysics. So it was Dr. Johnson who applied the term metaphysical to a group of poets including Cowley, and analyzed metaphysical imagery in his Life of Poetry. So it was first used by Dryden. Nevertheless, it was applied to a group of poets by Dr. Johnson. Now, what are the features of metaphysical poetry? In metaphysical poems, we see heated arguments, rough rhythms of speech, witty, cynical, metaphysical conceit is seen. Very often they employ shocking or dramatic style. As we studied, carpe diem philosophy is mentioned. And the major poets included obviously John Donne, then Robert Herrick, Thomas Carew, George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, Henry Vaughan, Thomas Traherne, and we can say that one of the last of the metaphysicals was John Cleveland. So in this section 12.7 they have given you an introduction to Henry Vaughan and a few others. Yes. So Henry Vaughan was somebody who fought on the royalist side in the Civil War. So he was inspired by George Herbert. His early verses showed elements of cavalier and pastoral poetry. Silex Scintillans, 1650. So that is often considered as the best work of his. Then there is The Retreat, The Waterfall, etc. So that's about him. Now comes Richard Crashaw. He was born in England. He revolted against his father's religion, Puritanism, etc. He also wrote Latin poetry. He used the Baroque style that we studied. He wrote secular poems. Steps to the Temple. Yes, that is one of the most famous poems by him. 1646. Steps to the Temple. Yes, I've seen this question also in objective examinations. About Traherne, Thomas Traherne, and he was actually kind of a little known person because nothing much is known about him. We know about some of his books like Roman Foreigners, then Christian Ethics, A Serious and Pathetical Contemplation, etc. So these books are suggestive of his wide and extensive reading of religious literature and political and social upheavals of the time, in social incidents of the time. So if we look at section 12.8, they have also mentioned the early Augustines there. Mid of the 17th century, some poets such as Denham or Cowley perceived a change in the sensibility of the people, and they made an artistic reflection of the changes witnessed. So in their poetry we have a predominance of reason, and this becomes the hallmark of the poetry of the 18th century, and this gradually came to be known as the Augustan poetry. So do you know who can be considered as the leading poet of this group? Abraham Cowley. He can be considered as the leading poet of this group. Cowley was also one of the founding members of the Royal Society. Okay, that is an additional information. It is also given in your textbook. So have an understanding regarding Edmund Waller, then Sir William Davenant, Sir John Denham, and Abraham Cowley. Cowley is important because one of his poems is also important. Yes, just make sure that you read in detail all these sections. So if we are to sum up this unit, we can understand that this period that we discussed is one of the most troubled times in the history of England. Why is that so? That's because the Civil War was there, the 30 Years' War was there, and the men of the era were torn between influences and counter-influences from the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Royal Society, the Bible, and so on. So there were numerous questions and conflicts as well associated with the era, and we discussed the major historical aspects, the cultural background, the literary background, the scientific background. We discussed the Spenserians, the Cavalier poets. Then we also mentioned the metaphysical poets as such of the era. And finally, a quick mention on the Augustines, the early Augustines as such. Now, let's move on to the next point. The next unit, Unit 13, it focuses solely on John Donne. Unit 13 is titled John Donne, Portrait of the Man, His Thematic and Technical Innovations, and a Study of 4 Love Poems.